night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Good evening, good morning, and welcome, everyone. It's Beyond Reality Radio. I'm JV Johnson. Thanks for being here tonight. We've got another great show lined up for you. Welcome to the new week, by the way. I always forget that the weekends are kind of long here because, we do a best of on Friday nights, and then we have a couple nights, and then we hit the ground running again for Monday night into Tuesday morning. And, we got to get revved up again. But I hope everybody had a great weekend, and I hope everybody was able to do something fun. But we've got a great week of shows starting tonight. We will have Marcus Allen on tonight, not the one who was in the NFL. A very different Marcus Allen. This Marcus Allen is the UK distributor for a magazine called Nexus Magazine. And he contends that the moon landings, like many other people, were faked. He's going to be talking about the evidence that supports that claim and the idea and the motivation behind the idea that NASA faked the whole thing. This is another contentious and somewhat controversial topic, but we don't shy away from that here on the program. And we will take your phone calls later, but we ask you to be respectful. As we say, you don't have to agree, but the conversation is well worth the time and energy. And it'd be interesting to hear what Marcus has to say. I'm excited about the conversation. Tomorrow night, Jason Jarrell, who is a student of philosophy and anthropology, he also studies ancient culture and the history of religion, will be with us. He's going to be talking about Native American cosmology. He'll explain the three realms of Native American cosmology and the supernatural beings who inhabit them, the symbolism of this cosmology, and the artifacts of the Adena and Hopewell mound builders of 2,000 years ago, and ancient North American giants. That's a lot of topic for one program, but that'll be tomorrow night. And then Wednesday, Sarba, and I use the name Sarba because that's his nickname, and his full name is a little difficult to pronounce, but we will let him do it. He says, just call him Sarba. He'll be with us. He's a paranormal investigator. He's going to talk about how paranormal research is different in India as compared to the rest of the world. Thursday night will be a best-of program because I will be on the road, and appreciate you tuning in for that. It'll be another great interview from the archives. So we have a lot going on. Speaking of being on the road, I am doing some traveling, and I want to make sure I let you know where I'm going to be in case you're in the area. You can visit. You can say hello. I'll be in Cincinnati, March 15th through the 17th at Horror Hound Convention. That's a horror fan convention. New Jersey HorrorCon is coming up at the end of the month. It's a little uncertain whether I'll be there, but I was intending to go. That's March 29th through the 31st. I might actually have a conflict with that. I'll let you know for sure. And then Seattle Crypticon coming up May 3rd through the 5th. So a bunch of traveling going on, and if you are near anywhere, any of those places, I'd love to see you. Stop in, say hello, shake a hand, get a picture, whatever. Always fun to do. Also, if you're going to be kind of cruising through social media, stop by my Facebook page. It's JV Johnson or just JVJ Paranormal. Either way, you'll find it, and give it a like. And if you haven't found the YouTube channel yet, it's a great way to kind of participate in the program. It's just JV Johnson on YouTube. If you need the full URL, it's youtube.com/C/JV Johnson. You'll see a lot of programs there. There's a video component as well, but it's really more just a way to archive. Plus, we do some special programming there. We'd love to have you subscribe to that channel as we build those numbers up. And the website, beyondrealityradio.com, is a great place to go. It lists all the radio stations in our affiliate family. It also has a page entitled Guests. I think it's listed as past guests on the menu heading. And on that page, you can actually go learn more about our guests, and you can also have links to their books or DVDs or whatever it happens to be that they are talking about when they are guests on the program. And let's see what, the Beyond Reality Radio coffee mug is also available on the website. So we certainly love getting those out and for people to use, and you can get them right on the website. Domestic shipping is included. If you're trying to get the mug shipped overseas, you're going to have to contact us, and we'll make a special arrangement for you to do that. So as you can see, a lot of great stuff going on. We are going to be talking about the Apollo missions and the moon landings. or the supposed moon landings. Our guest, Marcus Allen, tonight contends that they didn't happen, at least not the way we were told. So we'll get into that conversation in just a few minutes. We've got a lot to talk about tonight. Did you know that online retailers like Amazon have constant deals that can save you money on the things you buy every day? It's no joke. Save 40%, 50%, even 80% on great products, and all you have to do is know about them. Noodle Shark is the way to be alerted when something good is coming your way. Noodle Shark is the social media page that lists great deals that not only save you money, but give you the deals before anyone else has them. All you have to do is find Noodle Shark on Facebook. Search it as The Noodle Shark. That's The Noodle Shark, because you deserve to save too. Become a shark and save. Welcome back to the program. It's Beyond Reality Radio. I'm JV. Thanks for being here tonight. We've got a very interesting discussion about to take place here. And you've heard the contention before, but there are people who believe that the moon landings and the Apollo missions were not all they were cracked up to be. We've heard a lot of different versions of this story, and tonight Marcus Allen is going to present his version. We appreciate Marcus joining us on the program. Marcus, welcome to Beyond Reality Radio.
Hello, JV. Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So the first thing, this is the first time you've been on our program, so I guess the best place to start is tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get started in all of this?
Well, it goes back about 20 years, maybe a bit longer than that, when I was attending a lecture, a conference in Glastonbury. You probably heard of Glastonbury with the music festival.
Sure.
But there are also lots of other things that go on in Glastonbury. One of them is a series of lectures in which actually it was an American presenter who was talking about something quite different, but he happened to mention the Apollo moon landings. And he said, well, you've all seen the photographs. I say this was about 20 years ago. It was all you could see then with the photographs. And he said, of course, they're fake. You know that, don't you? And I thought, what a stupid thing to say. Now, I was trained as a photographer in London back in the 1960s, and I'd used the equipment, which I discovered subsequently that was used on the Apollo missions, the Hasselblad cameras, and I knew what the films could do or could not do. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at these pictures and just see if he's got a point. So I had a look at them, and the only way I could find the Apollo photographs was in books at the time, and I went to an astronomy show in London and got a series of postcards which showed some of the more well-known Apollo images, and I had a look at them, and I thought, oh, I see what he means. I can see that there's a certain amount of anomaly going on here, because I'd read quite a bit about the Apollo programs. I'm old enough to have been around when they actually happened. I know exactly what I was doing. I was looking out the window at 3:30 in the morning in London, where I was at the time, and looked at the moon and waved, but I didn't get any wave back. So I was familiar with what was going on. I was familiar with the equipment, and I started looking into it. And the more I looked into it, the more I found anomalies and inconsistencies and unexplained details. And from then on, I started doing public presentations on the subject, which were quite well received, by most people who hadn't really heard of this subject before. And they were interested to find out if they had been misled, possibly. Now, having started to look at it, I got into much more detail and started to finding other people who were also examining the same area. And they were finding similar anomalies, the same ones as I was. So we decided that maybe there was something amiss. Maybe we had been misled. Maybe Apollo was the very first example of fake news. And from that day onwards, 20-odd years ago, I've been investigating it pretty well full-time, looking at the photographs. Now they're all available on the internet, and one can download them and examine them and put them into various manipulation programs to see if there are any anomalies in the photographs. The more I did that, the more I found there were anomalies, such as the famous Earthrise photograph, which most people are familiar with, taken as the craft allegedly orbited the moon, with the Earth in the distance. And if you manipulate the photograph, you can find out that the Earth image has been added to the photograph. It's a double exposure. I thought, well, this is a bit odd. And the more I looked at it, and the famous ones of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder being photographed by Neil Armstrong, and you can see all the detail in his spacesuit, but he's in the shadow of the lunar lander. And he's coming down this ladder. There's a series of 8 photographs. which are available. Anybody can look them up on the NASA website, or the one I use is the Lunar and Planetary Institute website. It just happens to be I prefer the way they've set it out. And you download the photographs and look at them in sequence. Now, having been a photographer, I was used to looking at what were referred to, this is probably very 20th century, contact sheets. I don't know if you remember contact sheets.
Sure, yeah, it was a bunch of smaller images.
That's right. It's the images of the actual negatives. These are films, don't forget. We're not talking digital images here. We're talking films, photographic films. And if you look at the photographs in sequence, you can normally tell from looking at a contact sheet what a photographer is actually attempting to do, how he's building up to get the photograph which he subsequently uses. And I looked at these photographs, the 8 images of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder of the Eagle, the Apollo 11 lander, July the 20th, 1969. And there's 8 sequence, and there's 2 of him coming out at the top of the ladder. And then Neil Armstrong obviously gets bored watching him, takes a photograph of the rubbish bag under the lander and one of the foot pads of the lander. Now Buzz Aldrin is still coming down the ladder at this point. And then he takes another series of 6 photographs of him coming down the ladder, further down, until he gets to the bottom of the ladder and he stands in the footpad of the lander. And you can see highlights of light on his heel as he stands in the pad of the lander. Now, the only way you can get a highlight of light on a heel, in this case a fairly shiny piece of rubber-type material, is if there is a light source to put it there. But there's no light source carried on Apollo. So there we have a major anomaly. Now, I know that a very large company called NVIDIA have done their analysis of this particular sequence of images and have come to a conclusion that it was perfectly possible to photograph it that way because of the reflectivity of the lunar surface, which throw enough light to illuminate Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, who's actually in shadow. And then you start looking into that, and you find out that they've actually manipulated it so that it comes out like that, because the surface reflectivity of the moon is 8%, i.e. 8% of the light that hits it is reflected from it. It's similar to a road surface. That has a similar level of reflectivity as the moon does. But if you up the reflectivity to 40%, which is what appears to have happened with the NVIDIA film, you'll get enough light reflected back to show the figure as it appears in the photographs. So it's been manipulated. And they actually proved that it had been manipulated by doing this particular sequence. Anyway, I carried on investigating because there's more than just the Apollo 11 mission. That was the first one that landed. There were 2 before that, which didn't land on the moon, Apollo 8 and Apollo 10. Apollo 9 was in Earth orbit, so that was testing some equipment. Then you start looking at the rocket itself, the Saturn V rocket, that whacking great piece of kit, 363 feet high, weighed about 3,000 tons, we're told, and it was able to launch 130 tons into lunar orbit. And then of that, 46 tons were sent to the moon, to orbit the moon. And that included the lander and the command module and all the equipment needed to get down onto the surface and back up again. But if you examine the actual takeoff of the Saturn V rocket, it doesn't appear to be going fast enough to have reached the orbit speed it needed to do to launch into lunar orbit. And then you start looking at how the Saturn V rocket was built. It was designed by Werner von Braun, who was the head of the rocket assembly plant at Huntsville in Alabama. And you look at the engines that were used. Now, the engines that were used on the Saturn V rocket are called F1 engines, and they're the most powerful rocket engine ever built, we're told. But because they're so powerful, they're also rather unstable. And Apollo 6, which preceded, was the first launch of the Saturn V rocket, almost destroyed itself by what's called the Pogo Effect, where you get combustion instability, which all sounds very technical. It basically means that the amount of fuel that needs to get into the rocket engine is so great that it doesn't always burn at the same rate. And it sets up a Pogo Effect, jumping up and down, which basically shakes the rocket almost to destruction. And the reports indicate that on Apollo 6, if there had been astronauts on board that, given the combustion instability that occurred, they would highly unlikely have survived because of the sheer force that was involved. Anyway, from then on, it appears that the Apollo Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly because it launched 6 missions to the moon. Apollo 8 was the first one. Apollo 10, 9 missions to the moon. Apollo 10 was the second one, which didn't land. Then Apollo 11, 12, 13 was the one that didn't land either. We can come to that if you like later. 14, 15, 16, and 17. And then President Nixon, who was president at the time of the Apollo missions, cancelled the final 3 that were planned, 18, 19, and 20. And those rockets and equipment were used on the Skylab launch and also the Apollo-Soyuz link-up.
There's been some controversy over that historical event. Did it actually happen? If it did we see the actual images? Or was what we saw a production representing what had happened? There's a whole bunch here to talk about. Our guest tonight, Marcus Allen, he's been studying this for about 20 years. And Marcus, I want to get back to the point at which you had your aha moment and this started to appear on, forgive the pun, your horizon. You went to a presentation which presented some information that made you start questioning what the official story was or what we had all learned or saw or assumed. Had you had any inclination prior to that there might be something amiss here?
This was really the very first time which I'd heard that somebody mentioned the fact that maybe the Apollo missions weren't all that they were portrayed as. And that's what set me off. I'm always interested in finding out if things are correct or not. One has obviously heard about the controversy surrounding the JFK assassination, and the moon landings, I think, come into that same category. Obviously, with the internet now, it's a great deal easier to examine things and to research them and to find out information.
So,
sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. I just want to get back to because 20 years ago, when this first was presented to you, I'm trying to put it in perspective. We did have some internet, but I imagine it was much more difficult for you to get a hold of the photographs at the time and actually start looking at them yourself. What was the process at that point?
Well, it was really, as I said, I had to go out and buy a set of photographs. I couldn't download them on the internet because there was only, you remember dial-up internet?
Oh, yeah, sure, of course.
6K, I mean, it took forever to just write it. Emails were really only just coming into effect about the mid-90s, I think. I sent my first email.
Yeah.
But things have moved on very much since then, and it's really only in the last sort of 12, 15 years that it's been possible to examine this in detail. And what I discovered is there are a lot of people around the world who are examining this, and specifically the Russians. Now, one of the questions I usually get asked when I do public presentations on this subject is, well, if what you say is true, Marcus, how come the Russians didn't blow the whistle or announce that there was fraud going on or something fake happening? Why didn't they do that? Because it would have been to their benefit to say so.
Sure.
Which is it's something which is very easily assumed. But then if you look into it a little detail, you find out, well, the Russians would only have known what everybody else knew. They didn't have any special access to any information. They had a particularly different system of government, and it was not easy to access the information. It's only recently, since the demise of the Soviet Union, which is what Russia was, up till 1991, I believe, when the Berlin Wall was finally removed.
That's right.
And things sort of changed a bit. Now Russian scientists have started to examine the Apollo information in detail because they have access to it. And they have found enormous problems with it. The other people who've done probably more research now, it's only in the last sort of 15 years or so that they've been able to do the research. I've actually been interviewed on Russian television talking about this subject. Unfortunately, I couldn't understand what it was I said, so I assumed that what I said was just dubbed into Russian. But they do have a considerable interest in the subject, especially from the filmmakers, because they're examining the films that are available. And there's one particularly interesting or quite amusing incident where some Russian filmmakers, having watched the Mythbusters program about the Apollo missions, where they claimed that they had busted all the hoax claims, the Russians decided that they would try to recreate this program, try to recreate the situation that they saw the Mythbusters had done. And they found that there appeared to have been some deception involved, in that if you wear a white coat, which the Mythbusters did, or a white shirt, it will reflect enough light from the artificial light they were using to make the photograph of Aldrin coming down the ladder appear to be correct. Anyway, the Russians had sort of busted the Mythbusters, which I thought was quite amusing.
So let me take this back to the claim itself here. At what point in the story that we know, or that we've been told, at what point is the hoax involved? Were the rockets ever sent up? If they were sent up, were they just not sent to the moon? Were there no astronauts on board? Where does the line between, what we know to be fact versus what we are contesting here?
A good question, very interesting question, because it shows up what actually happened. Now, most people, if they're around at the time or have seen film since, will remember seeing film of the Saturn V rockets taking off. Those were totally real. Those did take off. Where they went to 2 minutes after they launched, we have to rely on NASA to tell us, because that is the only source of information. The rockets certainly were launched, and after 2 minutes, the first stage was jettisoned and fell into the Atlantic, and Jeff Bezos has actually recovered the engines that were used in that launch. Was recovered one of the engines, because all the Saturn V rockets were launched over the Atlantic towards Africa, and they would then circle the Earth for about an hour and a half. It takes an hour and a half to circle the Earth, and then they would launch from there. They would launch into what's called trans-lunar injection. They would fire the rocket again, or fire the third stage of the rocket, to get it fast enough, because in order to leave Earth's gravity, you have to accelerate up to 25,000 miles an hour. If you're in Earth orbit, you're doing 17,500 miles an hour. That's why it stays in Earth orbit and doesn't go off to the moon. If you're going to go to the moon, or any rocket that leaves Earth's gravitational field, has to accelerate to 25,000 miles an hour, which requires a considerable amount of fuel to do it, albeit there isn't the air resistance you'll get in the lower atmosphere. And we'll come back to the atmosphere and how that affects the returning craft later, possibly. So after the launch, 2 minutes after the launch, the rocket disappears from view, and we have to rely on NASA to tell us what happened until we see it coming back down to Earth on its 3 parachutes, in the case of Apollo 11, 8 days after the launch. The astronauts were picked up from the Pacific with President Nixon watching, and they were then flown back to Houston to go into quarantine for 3 weeks. Now, where the rocket went, we have to rely on NASA to tell us. Did it go to the moon? Well, most people will say, of course it went to the moon. I saw the TV pictures of they were walking around on the lunar surface. How could that not be true? Well, I've seen 80-foot gorillas climb the Empire State Building. Is that real? I've seen dinosaurs chasing kids around kitchens in Jurassic Park. Very persuasive. We know it's not real because we know it's a film. But Apollo is presented as fact, as documentary evidence. In fact, there was a very good film made called First Man, released a few months ago, which I saw on the IMAX screen over here in the UK. And it's a very, very professional piece of Hollywood filmmaking. Hollywood can do an amazing amount of not deception, because we know what we're watching. You know, when we watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's great masterpiece, we know we're watching a film, and these are models, but we're prepared to suspend our disbelief and consider that it might be on its way to Jupiter. Now, Apollo, we're told, went to the moon, and we've seen the pictures of the astronauts on the moon. We've seen the 5,771 photographs taken on the lunar surface by all the Apollo missions. How can it not be real? How can it not be true? Very easily. If we go back a little bit to the beginning of the Apollo program, which was announced by President John Kennedy in May 1961, purely as a political statement following the orbit of the Earth by Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union, President Kennedy, who'd only been in office for about 4 months at that point, and he'd already had to deal with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he had to do something to show that America were going to be, if not the leaders, in space travel. We're going to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return to the Earth. That was his challenge. Nobody at that time in America had even been into orbit. Alan Shepard had been up in the rocket and come straight back down again. It wasn't even an orbital flight. That was John Glenn about a year later. So America didn't actually know if they could do it, but the challenge was there. And in November 1963, we all know what happened to John Kennedy. So the martyred president's challenge had to be met. And this was the mission that Apollo was going to fulfill. Now, 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program at the height of the activity in about 1965. They were doing the very best job they could. They were building the best rockets they could, the best landers they could, the best control centers they could, the best spacesuits. They were doing whatever they were asked to do. They didn't know of any deception. Nobody knew of any deception at that time, except possibly a few people at the head of NASA who at some point in the mid-1960s, probably around the time of the disastrous events of Apollo 1, where 3 astronauts were killed when their spacecraft, which was being tested on Earth, exploded as a result of pressurized oxygen, which was filling the spacecraft. Anybody knows that if you put oxygen under pressure and then put an ignition source in it, it's going to explode. It's called a calorific bomb. And at that point, the Apollo program was virtually stopped, but they only had another 3 years to get to the moon, from January 1967 to the end of 1969. Were they going to be able to do it? Or were they going to have a plan B, a backup? Because one of the other points, which is quite often overlooked, though it's very obvious when you think about it, that all the Apollo missions were going to be live on television. Live on television. The one thing that NASA did not want to happen, or certainly nobody wanted to happen, was to see an astronaut die live on television.
Right.
So they had to make sure that it didn't happen. So was there a backup plan that could be shown as if the missions were for real? Because there is a very severe danger in traveling to the moon. It's called radiation. About 500 miles above the Earth's surface starts what's called, or what's known as now, the Van Allen radiation belts, named after Professor James Van Allen of Iowa University, who first identified them by the simple expedient of putting a Geiger counter on top of a rocket, sending it up, and seeing what the readings were. And as they said at the time, my God, space is radioactive. Because the readings of the Geiger counter were so severe that it would almost certainly be lethal to any unprotected human traveling through them. So I then looked, was there sufficient radiation protection in the spacecraft? Answer, no. Did they have any radiation protection in their spacesuits when they walked around on the lunar surface? Answer, no. So what was going on here? How were these? And if you've seen the recent test of the Orion capsule, which is Apollo 2.0, the Orion capsule was sent out in December 2014, about 5,000 miles out on its first test, and then it was brought back. And there's a film where a NASA engineer says there are dangers of radiation, and we have to ensure that we can protect our astronauts before we send them through it. Well, why don't you just use what you used on Apollo? It seemed to be pretty successful then.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Has anybody ever put that question to a NASA official and gotten a satisfactory answer? When the question is asked, how were these astronauts protected in the high levels of radiation of space? Have we got an answer to that at all? And then we have to take a quick break.
Well, basically, they went through them so fast it didn't affect them.
Okay. All right. We're talking with Marcus Allen. We're talking about the moon landings and whether or not they occurred the way we saw them play out on television or if they occurred at all. It's a conspiracy that's been talked about for a while. We're getting down to some of the nitty-gritty here. It's Beyond Reality Radio. We have a lot more to come. Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johhaw. That's JOHAW. Marcus, this is a short segment. We only have a couple minutes here before we have to go to our top of the hour break. We've talked a lot about some of the evidence that might support the idea that the Apollo missions did not happen as they were portrayed. We haven't talked a lot about motivation. Let's take the next couple minutes and talk about the motivation of faking such a monumental hoax. Why would NASA or the U.S. government, or anybody for that matter, want to fake something of this magnitude?
That's a very good question, and it basically you need to look at the Apollo program in the context of its time. This is the 1960s, where we have the Cold War going on between the Soviet Union and the United States. We have the Vietnam War ramping up from the mid-1960s onwards, with horrific images coming through. We have the space race going on, where the United States need to demonstrate their technical superiority. Apollo was the good news in a decade of assassinations and disaster and social unrest. The civil rights movement was also in full swing. There was a great deal of bad news. Apollo was going to be the good news, and it was, because it was successful, or it appeared to be, was presented as being successful. It was perfectly possible to recreate all the Apollo images here on Earth. And in fact, that was done. All the missions were simulated. There was a lot of training took place. None of it secret. Everybody knew what was going on. In fact, there's a full-scale replica of the Sea of Tranquility where Apollo 11 landed at Cinder Lake outside Flagstaff in Arizona. You can go and see it today. There are also models made, large models. A lot of simulation, a lot of training was done. Therefore, it would be perfectly possible to film the whole thing here on Earth. And I contend that that was what was done, but presented as being shown live from the moon. Now we then have to ask the question, what power would be required to transmit a television picture live from the moon to the Earth, 240,000 miles? And most people will say, well, you just point it in the right direction and you pick it up here on Earth. There's nothing to stop the picture coming through. Well, there's 240,000 miles of space, and you do get a loss of power over that distance. You then get the atmosphere it has to travel through. It has to be collected by a big receiver, and the only one that did it for Apollo 11 was based in Australia at Honeysuckle Creek. There were 3 other receivers in California and in Spain, so that the whole thing could be recorded as it happened. But was it being recorded from the moon, or was it here on Earth and being transmitted through a very complex computer system.
We've got a great show underway with Marcus Allen. We're talking about the Apollo missions and the moon landings. Did they really happen? And we're going to continue that conversation in just a few moments. Tomorrow night on the program, Jason Jarrell will be here to talk about Native American cosmology. He's an expert in philosophy, anthropology, ancient culture, and the history of religion. And he'll explain the three realms of a Native American cosmology and the supernatural beings who inhabit them, also the symbolism of this cosmology and the artifacts of the Adena and Hopewell mound builders of 2,000 years ago. And we'll also talk about North American giants. And then Sarba will be with us Wednesday night. He is a paranormal investigator, and he's going to be talking about how paranormal research is different in India as compared to the rest of the world. It'll be interesting to hear that comparison and those contrasts. But again, tonight we're talking about NASA and the moon landings, or the reported moon landings. Our guest tonight, Marcus Allen. Marcus, you've been doing this for a lot of years, and you have to know this is a controversial and probably an emotional topic for a lot of people.
That's very true, and it's one of the major obstacles for people being able to confront what's going on. Because, as you say, it is an emotional subject. People really want to believe that this happened. Because if they're American, as obviously many of your listeners will be, this is almost part of American culture. So how can some Brit come along and challenge it? I mean, it doesn't make sense, really, does it? Or maybe it does, because somebody outside the emotional bubble, which NASA has built around the Apollo missions, may well be able to look more dispassionately at it. And I hope that's what I can do. And in fact, there's been a considerable amount of research recently. There are two new books just been published. They're on Amazon. One is called The Apollo Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 1. Now, that's by a Canadian author called Randy Walsh. But his book is extremely interesting because he is a commercial pilot, so he knows about how to navigate across distances, which is what the Apollo missions did coming back from the moon. It's not simple as saying, well, there's the Earth, we'll just go for it, because the Earth is moving in relation to the Apollo craft in this case. So did they have the computing power to be able to navigate across 240,000 miles of space? If you're navigating an aircraft, you use radio beacons. You don't fly by following a river, or not anymore, you used to back in the 1920s. You don't follow by landmarks, you follow by extremely sophisticated navigational equipment. But Apollo didn't have any of this. The computing power on Apollo was almost minuscule compared to what you carry around with a smartphone today. So there is considerable amount of doubt that it was possible to navigate from the Earth to the moon, let alone from the moon back to the Earth. And coming back to the Earth is actually one of the most remarkable stories of survival that I can think of. If you're coming back from the moon, you arrive on Earth at 25,000 miles an hour, same speed you left at. It's the gravitational attraction that is accelerating you. But you've got to slow down, otherwise you're going to get toast. And the only way to slow down, because spacecraft don't have brakes, you've got to slow down by using the atmosphere, which is only 75 miles, starts 75 miles above the Earth's surface, the atmosphere itself. You've got to use the atmosphere to slow you down. By doing that, you're going to generate enormous amount of heat. So you have to have a heat shield. And a heat shield is made of material which will basically destroy itself in the heat of re-entry. Now, if you're coming back to the Earth, you've got to come back at a very, very acute angle. You can't hit the Earth head on, or you will be toast, you'll be pancaked. You've got to come in at 6.5 degrees to the Earth's surface, so you've got about 1,000 miles to slow down. But you're doing 25,000 miles an hour, so it's not going to take you very long. So the gravitational forces exerted on the spacecraft are really quite severe. They used the heat shield, which apparently slowed all 9 Apollo craft coming back from the moon, slowed them down successfully. But when the same craft was, when the same attempt was used on the Orion craft in December 2014, the heat shield almost disintegrated. So why don't they just use the formula they used for the Apollo? It's called AV5061, half-cut. And also, another strange thing about the Orion craft was it had heat shield all over it. The Apollo craft didn't. The Apollo craft are made of aluminium, and aluminium melts at 600 degrees centigrade. The heat of re-entry will generate up to 3,000 degrees centigrade of heat. So why wasn't the craft destroyed? That's an unanswered question. I don't know the answer to it.
Let's we've put so much information on the table here, and we're gonna find our time up before we know it. I want to get back to the photographs because I want to go through them a little more completely. You mentioned, I don't know which one you want to start with. You mentioned the Earth rise, or the is that what you call it? The Earth rise photograph, where the Earth is coming up on the horizon of the moon.
That's right, yeah.
Let's talk about that one for a second. You said you've analyzed that, and other people have analyzed it, and the way it appears to you is that the Earth was actually superimposed into that photograph, and it wasn't there in the original shot.
That certainly would be the implication of seeing the Earth surrounded by a box, indicating it's been added on, possibly in Photoshop or some other means of adding it on. It's quite easy to
well,
do.
It couldn't have been Photoshop in 1969, right, or in the early 70s. I mean, I don't think there was anything like that back then. So it would have had to have been done mechanically, right?
That's right. Yes, it'd been done mechanically. But one point about the photographs is, let's look at the camera that took these photographs, because it was the same camera. I'm obviously not the same one, but the same model of camera. It was made by Hasselblad. That's Victor Hasselblad in Sweden, made the camera to NASA specification. Now, one of the things they did on the camera, they took the viewfinder away. Because if you're wearing a spacesuit, you can't get your head down, because on a Hasselblad, the viewfinder is on top of the camera. If you're wearing a spacesuit, you can't get your head down to look through the viewfinder, so they took it away. So they had no viewfinder. It was also manually controlled using rings to set the shutter speed, the aperture opening, and the focus. That all had to be done by hand, because there was no automatic focus on these cameras. The only automatic feature was the film wind. It would wind the film forward automatically when you press the shutter. The shutter button on a Hasselblad is on the front of the camera, which you can't see from inside a spacesuit.
So there's no viewfinder on this camera, yet the person operating it has to know how to somehow focus the camera.
Exactly. You can point the camera more or less in the direction of the picture you want to take. But if you ever tried photographing something without looking through the viewfinder of a camera, you'll find that you quite often don't get somebody's head in, or
right.
You get it entered. It's best to use a viewfinder or a screen if you're using digital. But these are film cameras. They weren't using a viewfinder. They were wearing a spacesuit, so they couldn't feel very much through the armored gauntlets that a spacesuit would supply, because it's pressurized inside. And there are reports of astronauts finding their hands are getting damaged inside the spacesuit because they're operating against the pressure that is 5 pounds per square inch pressure inside the spacesuit to keep them alive, because there's no pressure outside.
Right.
And if they damaged their spacesuit, or there was any leak in the spacesuit, they would experience what divers refer to as the bends. It's the oxygen or the gases in the bloodstream coming out. And it's very, very painful. And it's actually lethal if you don't stop it very rapidly.
Right.
So all these restrictions on use, some of the most iconic images of the 20th century were produced. And I contend that it was extremely unlikely that, given those limitations of use, the great number of photographs, right, some of them aren't particularly interesting, but there are a lot of photographs. There's 5,771 taken on the lunar surface. You can add them up, and you can look at them all now. And some of them are pretty boring things, but some of them are very, very interesting to look at. So you've got these restrictions on use, which most people are not really familiar with. They sort of look at the photographs and assume, well, those are good photographs. They're obviously very good photographers, these astronauts. Well, the only person who's done any creative work since being an astronaut is Alan Bean from Apollo 12, who's a very good painter. But none of them, to my knowledge, have taken up photography to any great extent since then. All right, they could practice a lot. And a lot of professional photographers will say, oh, you can use a camera without a viewfinder quite easily. But you've got to take lots and lots and lots of pictures to make sure you get the right one. And they didn't do that on Apollo.
If you look through the over 5,000 photographs that are available, first of all, was that the whole volume of what was taken, or is that just what was deemed good enough for or worth viewing? Do we know if there are others taken that we just haven't seen because they might be out of focus, or they might be off? The image or the subject of the photograph wasn't centered, or something along those lines?
No, they're now all online. Every single photograph taken on the lunar surface.
So if you look through those photographs, which I'm sure you have, are there many that fall within those flaws that you mentioned, like it wasn't aimed properly or wasn't in focus, or any of those flaws show up in any of those photographs?
There are some, but surprisingly few. There are some where they have inadvertent shutter release, and it's pointed in some weird direction. But they're relatively few and far between.
It sure seems like that would be a pretty common problem, and that's why you would want to take so many pictures, because many of them, maybe as many as, and this is just me speculating, maybe as many as half of them would be either out of focus or not pointed properly or whatever it happens to be.
Well, sure. I mean, that's the logical explanation, that you would say, well, let's take lots and lots of pictures and maybe a few of them will come out really well, because we're not using a viewfinder and we're using, in effect, heavy-duty gardening gloves to control the camera, which is not very advisable. I mean, Hasselblad's a very, very good camera. There's no dispute about that.
Yeah. Marcus, I want to jump to the phone lines here and grab a listener call before we have to go to break again. This is Maggie calling from Kansas. Hi, Maggie. Welcome to the program.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. This is from Mr. Marcus Allen. Sir, I have a question for you, because I've been reading a lot about, about space rockets and missiles and all that. Anyway, I have all my black and white books. I don't do anything on the computer. I go to the library and pick up the books and stuff. But in 1957, when the United States made the first U.S. man-made planet, it was called Pioneer 4, with the Roman numeral 4. And it went through the inner Van Allen belt and out through the outer Van Allen belt, and it revolves around the sun today. They say it should last up there for about 15 million years, and it's full of hardware. It's only about 13 feet high, and it's shaped like a cone, but it was made out of fiberglass and gold plate, and that was able to retract the radiation. And today we have a thing called silver thread technology that we put around our nuclear reactors, of course with the insulation inside. But I used to sew the material, and I have a lot of the silver thread technology, the material
Maggie,
that goes around the insulation.
Maggie, is your question, yes, I'm sorry, just want to make sure I get to your question here, because we have to go to break in a minute. Your question here is why, if that craft could do it, why didn't the Apollo capsules have the ability to do this? Is that what you're asking?
Well, my question is, if the first U.S. man-made planet called Pioneer 4 is out there, and it was made in 1957, they already knew how to get through the radiation belt.
Yeah, but I think that was without human life. Let's get Marcus's reaction here.
Well, it's certainly true to say that there are satellites, there have been launches way beyond the Van Allen belts, but these are all unmanned craft. It's perfectly possible to protect the electronics and the guidance systems on unmanned craft by what's called hardening that, which is basically protecting them, putting lead, various other means of protecting them. But protecting humans is very, very different. Humans are very susceptible to radiation damage. It affects our DNA, and that's where you get mutations. So if you can protect humans, yes, they could go beyond the Van Allen radiation belts, but they're still going to be exposed to what are called galactic cosmic rays, which come from deep space, solar particle events, which are basically solar flares, and all the radiation that we are protected from comes from the sun. These are X-rays and gamma rays, you've got all the damaging effects on humans beyond the Van Allen belts. We're very well protected here on Earth. We're not designed to travel in space. Humans are not specifically designed to. You can send animals, certain animals, and the Russians sent tortoises to the moon, to orbit the moon, and they came back perfectly happy. Well, they're probably quite glad to get home. What isn't generally known is that a tortoise can survive 15,000 times the levels of radiation that humans can. So it's not a very fair comparison. It's one of the major difficulties for humans to travel beyond Earth's protective layer of the Van Allen belt.
Maggie, do you have a quick comment here? I have to go to break.
Yes, sir. Mr. Allen, would you like a research assistant?
I tell you what, Maggie, let me do this. Hang on the line. We're going to get some contact information from you. We'll pass it on to Marcus in case that is something he's interested in. All right, we have to take a break. We've got a lot more to go. It's Beyond Reality Radio. I'm JV Johnson. Thanks for being here. Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johhaw. That's JOHAW. Our phone number is 844-687-7669 if you would like to join our discussion. We're talking with Marcus Allen about the Apollo missions and the moon landing. Marcus, one of the things that's always bothered me about all of this is that we went to the moon in 1969 using what could only be considered crude technology by today's standards. And yet, 50 years later, we haven't been back. And it seems to me with the advances in computers and all technologies that it would be a far easier task to do it today than it was obviously in 1968 and 69. What is it's hard to understand why we haven't revisited the moon if we did it the first time.
That's probably the most interesting point of it all, because 50 years ago, we landed men on the moon. 12 men walked on the lunar surface, we're told. And now in 2019, there's never been an attempt to duplicate that. It's like Charles Lindbergh flying the Atlantic in 1927, solo for the first time, and nobody flying in the Atlantic since. That makes no sense. We're flying in jumbo jets with 500 people on board several times a day. That's technology. That's what happens. That's how man advances. But going to the moon appears to be a one-off, almost legendary event, disappearing into the realms of history. To many people, it is history. It is something that their parents and maybe their grandparents would talk about. And in fact, there's a very unsettling book that's just been published with somebody looking into the whole Apollo missions. And he interviewed a teacher. Well, he was actually giving a talk in a school over here in the UK. And the science teacher said, "What do you mean men have landed on the moon? I'd have known about it. I'm a science teacher." They didn't know it had happened. It's drifting into history. And yet, here we are. I think it was yesterday, the Dragon capsule launched on the SpaceX rocket finally made it to the International Space Station, albeit didn't have anybody on board except a dummy. Because for the last 6 years, NASA have had to use the Russian Soyuz rocket to get their astronauts to the International Space Station. And also, the rockets that are used to launch other rockets here in America, the engines are made in Russia. What have NASA been doing for the last 50 years? They don't appear to have advanced at all. It's a very sad event because I'm an enthusiast for space travel. I love it. The whole idea of traveling in space is something that we want to do. It's what humans do. We explore. We want to find out what's around the next corner, what's over the next hill. Where does that river go to? That's what we do. We explore. But as you say, we haven't attempted to go back to the moon.
Could an argument be made that, yeah, we were there, there's nothing there of any value, why go back?
There's something of great value on the moon. It's called knowledge. Why have the Chinese just landed their Chang'e 4 unmanned craft on the far side of the moon? It's called the far side, by the way. It's not the dark side. That's the record by Pink Floyd.
Right.
It's the far side because it's away from Earth. They've landed their unmanned craft on the far side of the moon because it's of interest to them. The Indians are trying to do it. The Japanese are trying to do it. The European Space Agency are trying to do it. Everybody wants to go to the moon, not with astronauts, because that's very difficult, but they want to explore it. They consider that there is a great mineral wealth on the moon. It's called helium-3, I believe. This is something which would be commercially viable if people could get there. They want to get there. They want to be able to explore.
Talk to me about the moon rocks. Talk to me about the debris, the samples that were brought back from the moon. Have they been tested? Are they unique in any way? Do we have a way to verify that they are from the moon?
Well, there's 842 pounds of moon rock apparently were brought back by the 6 Apollo missions that landed. Have you seen any?
I certainly haven't, no.
Well, very few people have actually seen a moon rock. I claim to have a piece of moon rock here. It sort of looks like a piece of rock, basically. It's got little pits in it. It's made up of different types of material, which is what we're told moon rock consists of. But when the moon rock was brought back, there's an amusing story about what happened over in Holland. There was a piece of moon rock displayed in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the National Museum of Holland, which said it had been presented to the Dutch Prime Minister of the day, Wilhelm Dries, by the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, on their world tour. But it was a lump of rock, weighed about 3 ounces. It is what you expect moon rock to look like. And when the Rijksmuseum was being renovated about 10 years ago, they took the display down, and a geologist said, "Oh, could we examine it while it's not on display?" And they said, "Yeah, go ahead." And they found it was petrified wood, not rock.
How does that mistake get made?
Well, the other part of the story is that the card which accompanied this rock was not attached to it. It was found in the late Wilhelm Dries's possessions after he died. And his family thought, well, this must be something to do with the Apollo missions. We'll better give it to the Rijksmuseum. Now, it's known that the Apollo 11 astronauts did not present moon rock to the countries they visited. That was sent officially from America in little grains of dust encapsulated in plastic for all the nations of the world, and the 50 American states were also presented with it to commemorate this great achievement. Yet another piece of propaganda. So you've got this mysterious piece of moon rock, which may well not have been a piece of moon rock at all. What the astronauts, the Apollo 11 astronauts, probably presented the Prime Minister with was a signed photograph. That's much more likely, because they only had 21 pounds of moon rock when Apollo 11 came back, and they were still examining it. So it's an amusing story, and it was described as being a curio. And you've
been researching and studying this for a long time. Has anything over the course of that period of time been proven to be not what you thought it was? In other words, any of this evidence that we may not have talked about tonight, but you've talked about over the course of 20 plus years that you've looked into this, actually come around and you realize that that it was misinterpreted and you don't use that as evidence anymore?
One or two small details. I describe various photographs which have highlights of light in the astronaut's eyes. And I say, well, that would indicate that it was using a flash, which is what the artifact of the highlight of light in the eye is. It's the artifact of a flash gun. It's what celebrity photographs have. And I say, well, how come this was taken on the moon if they didn't have a flash gun? But it shows a flash gun in Armstrong's eyes. And one or two people have come back and said, no, that's not the case. It's just a reflection off one of the windows. Well, that may be the case. I don't know for certain. But I still present it as being evidence that a flash gun was used. And nobody's disputed that, because the evidence would appear to be fairly strong. But there are some much more relevant pieces of information in terms of, well, did they go or didn't they go? Which is basically the question that I would have answered.
Yeah.
I've yet to find any evidence to confirm that they went, which can't be disproved.
Is there any way to observe any of the artifacts that the astronauts themselves left behind on the moon?
Good question. Good question. Because, yes, that happened 10 years ago. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, unmanned craft, was sent back to the moon to photograph the moon yet again. It's been photographed many times. This particular one had very high quality equipment, we're told, and it was going to specifically try to locate the Apollo landing sites. And NASA proudly presented their evidence that they had found them. And here they were. Here's the Apollo 11 site, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. But the only way you could tell what you're looking at in the photograph is courtesy of NASA. They put a large arrow pointing at what looks like a smudge on the photograph. Now, these photographs were taken from 15 miles above the lunar surface. But all it shows is a couple of pixels, which may be a shadow of something. But unless you're told, as NASA kindly tell us, the Apollo 11 craft, the Apollo 12 craft, and the bits and pieces, and you can see the footprints that the astronauts made on the lunar surface. Look, they go from one place to another. And there's the lunar rover. So they're very proud of the photographs, but they don't actually show any detail. They just show various...
Did you say they pointed out footprints and tracks?
Yes, that's what they claim to have.
Is it feasible that those footprints and tracks would remain today? I mean, the moon gets bombarded with things, and that surface gets affected, I would imagine. 50 years later, would it still be there?
Well, technically it would be, because there's no wind, there's no rain, there's nothing to disturb the surface.
Well, it gets hit by objects from space.
Oh, yes, you get micrometeorites. There's lots of stuff will fall out of space. It falls on Earth as well. But we don't see it because it
burns
usually
up. Yeah.
But on these photographs, if you look at, as I'm sure many people have done, look at your own house on Google Earth.
Right.
And you can see a car parked outside the front door.
That's right. You can, yes.
And you can tell if it's got a sunroof or not, so you know which way it's pointing.
That's true.
And those photographs were taken from 400 miles above the Earth, through the Earth's atmosphere and the pollution and the dust that's contained in the atmosphere. On the moon, there's no pollution, there's no dust, there's no atmosphere. So how come using 2009 technology, we can't see any better than a couple of smudges on a picture which need a bigger arrow to tell us what we're looking at? It doesn't make any sense. And that's the only evidence that NASA will be able to come up with. And now they've come out with the no-fly zone. Nobody is allowed to go within 2 kilometers of any of the Apollo 11 or Apollo 17 landing sites.
Who's anybody? Who? I mean, other than NASA themselves. I mean, how are they going to enforce that?
Good question. I don't know, because they can't even fly to the moon yet. So they can't. It was basically to stop people from who were trying to get the Google X prize of $30 million for the first people to land a craft on the moon and get it to move 500 kilometers and take some photographs and transmit them back to the Earth. They were trying to stop people going anywhere near the Apollo 11 landing site, the Apollo 17 landing site, which seems a bit sad, really, because surely we want to see if they're there. I'd love to see if there was something on the moon taken there by man, but at the moment I've yet to see it.
What would be your reaction if there was an aha moment where you realized actually this did happen and you've been wrong?
I'd say, I'm very sorry. I'll shut up and go away.
But would you be relieved in any way?
Yes, I would. I'd be delighted to know it really happened. I watched it happen when it was supposed to be happening for real. I'd love to know it was true, because that would mean that man could fly to the moon, so we could do it again. But we don't seem to be able to.
Do you have an opinion about that footage? Was it Stanley Kubrick, which is what a lot of people who believe it was faked, was the person that orchestrated that?
Good point. No, I think Stanley Kubrick was far too preoccupied with the finishing edit and composition of his masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, because that was released in 1968.
Right.
What I do think somebody I think who may have had a connection with the whole Apollo fabrication was his special effects director, Stanley Kubrick, Douglas Trumbull, who was known to be a genius at special effects. He worked on the special effects of 2001 and Blade Runner, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and several other films. Back to the Future he worked on as well. He was able to use models very, very effectively. Now, there is a film which has been recently released, but I think it's disappeared off YouTube. It's called Make Believe, Smoke and Mirrors. It's 2 hours, 44 minutes long, and it's an extremely technically advanced piece of filmmaking explaining how the whole Apollo hoax was carried out. It's very complex. Unfortunately, the narrator doesn't want to be identified, so his voice has been disguised to the extent that you can't actually hear very much of what he's saying. But somebody has taken those films and subtitled them so you can hear or you can understand what is being said. It is very, very detailed, and it's probably produced by somebody who not only was working with the Apollo simulation exercises, but knows exactly how film works.
Marcus, we're just out of time here. Now, from what I understand, you don't have a book. Is there a book or something? I don't think you've written a book. You're doing this because you want people to know.
Well, basically, yes. But there's one very good website I can highly recommend if somebody wants to follow up on any of this information. It's a website. It's very easy. Owlis. That's A for Alpha, U for Uncle, L for Lima, I for India, S for Sierra. Owlis.com. And you'll be able to read an enormous amount of very, very well-written information, some of it from Russian physicists and scientists and filmmakers, translated into English. And that website has been in existence for over 25 years. It's gathered a great deal of information. And the webmasters behind it also produced the film, which is probably one of the definitive films on the subject, called What Happened on the Moon. It's definitely worth a watch. And if you can see another DVD that's just come out, it's called American Moon, by an Italian filmmaker called Massimo Mazzucco, which is 3.5 hours long. It goes into great detail about the fabrication of the Apollo moon landings and some very highly skilled professional photographers examining the lunar photographs and saying, well, they were taken here on Earth. You can see the shadows. You can see all the fill-in light. They didn't have any, so it must have been done here on Earth. Definitely worth a watch.
Marcus, Marcus, thank you so much for being here. We're just out of time. I'd love to have you back on the program because I know there's a lot of things we just didn't get time to cover.
Sure, no, that's fine. I'd be delighted to do that.
All right, thank you. Marcus Allen, did you have any social media or anything you wanted to send folks to for yourself?
Not so much for myself, but for the magazine that we produce called Nexus Magazine. Go to nexusmagazine.com. It's on sale in Barnes & Noble and other good bookshops around. It's the world's leading alternative news magazine, covering just these sort of subjects and the subjects that you cover on the radio as well.
Great.
Definitely worth reading. Nexus Magazine, guys. That's the one to buy.
All right. Thanks so much. Marcus Allen, it's Nexus Magazine. Check that out. So my late night routine has been the last few nights watching old episodes of Columbo with Peter Falk. Really enjoy those for some reason. I don't know. Anyway, thank you to Marcus Allen for being with us tonight. He's got no book. He's doing this because he wants to get his perspective out. A lot of people think that there is something to this, and I think the questions are valid questions. It's an interesting conversation nonetheless. Remember, tomorrow night we've got Jason Jarrell talking about Native American cosmology on the program. That's going to do it for tonight. Beyond Reality Radio, I'm JV. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you tomorrow night.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by JV Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.